On a stormy night, a lonely old woman stumbled upon a tiny creature inside a trash can. She never imagined that one small decision would lead to a journey filled with laughter, tears, and even danger. From mischief and clever tricks to unexpected loyalty, the raccoon gave her the greatest gift of all, a chance to love and to live again. But sometimes, true love means learning to let go. The rain had weight to it that afternoon in Ohio, the kind that turns the air to glass and makes every porch step slick. Margaret held the grocery bag tight against her chest as she shuffled from the bus stop, her old yellow raincoat darkened to mustard by the downpour. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and the faint sweetness of crushed maple leaves. At 72, she had learned to move carefully, one foot testing the ground before the other committed. Even careful steps, though, couldn't quiet the way the rain seemed to echo in a house that had felt too quiet for too long. Halfway down Walton Street, a sound rose above the water's patter. Not a voice, and not quite a cry. It was a small metallic rattle, then a rustle, then stillness. Margaret paused, listening. Again it came, a thin clink, like a spoon tapping a jar. She turned her head and saw it. A county trash can tipped on its side near the curb, lid askew, a slick of rainwater running from its mouth. She would have kept walking. She told herself she should. The bag was heavy, and her shoes were already wet. But the rattle came again, followed by a soft, miserable whimper. Something inside her, something that remembered bandaging skinned knees in her classroom and checking lunchboxes for forgotten sandwiches, drew her toward the can. "Hello there," she said, as if speaking to a child hiding under a table. The word came out with a tremor she didn't care to notice. She set her groceries on a drier patch of sidewalk and lifted the lid. The smell of wet paper and old apple peels lifted into the rain. Beneath a soggy pizza box, two small paws, dark and delicate, pawed weakly at nothing. Margaret swallowed. She pushed the box aside. A little body huddled there, soaked to the skin, fur clumped into stripes and smudges, eyes filmed with fatigue. He was no kitten and no pup, not with that neat little bandit mask and that ringed tail curled around him like a question mark. He gave a low sound, not a growl so much as a warning that had run out of strength. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "Who tossed you into this mess?" The animal flinched when she reached in with her gloved hand. His claws were tiny hooks, but he did not use them. He simply shrank, as if to become invisible. Margaret glanced up and down the street. No one stood in a window. No one called out a claim. The rain ran from the brim of her hat and into her collar. She thought of the quiet of her living room and the photograph of Harold smiling from the mantel, the way his suit jacket sat a little too broad on his shoulders. She thought of how the tick of the wall clock grew larger after supper, until it was the only sound a person could hear. "If I leave you, you will not survive this," she thought. "If I take you, I may be a fool." "Come on then," she whispered. She slid both hands under his body, feeling the quick thud of his heart through the soaked fur. He trembled, but he did not fight. She tucked him against her raincoat and turned for home, leaning her weight into the wind. The grocery bag thumped her leg with every step. Her little house sat where Walton Street bent toward the creek, a square of cedar shingles and flower beds, edged with stones Harold had gathered over the years. On the porch, Margaret set the groceries aside and knelt, her knees popping in protest. She looked into the animal's face. Rain streaked his whiskers into points. He stared back, not pleading, simply enduring. "We'll make you warm," she said. "We'll see about the rest." Inside, The house smelled of cinnamon tea and clean laundry. She spread an old towel near the heater vent and wrapped another around the little body. He gave a soft huff when the warm air touched him. She fetched a shallow bowl and filled it with water, tipping it gently toward his nose. He sniffed and turned his head away. She tried again, and his tongue flicked once, then again. The sound of sipping was the smallest relief she had felt in months. She moved slowly, talking as she went. Habit, perhaps. Teachers never forget the soothing rhythm of narration. "I'm going to get you some broth," she said. "Not much. We'll start with just a little." She heated chicken broth and let it cool while she pat-dried his fur. He was lighter than she expected, and she could feel the knobs of his spine under her fingers. She noticed a scrape along one foreleg, crusted with dirt, and the way his breathing occasionally hitched, as if each breath had to decide if it was worth the trouble. When she offered the broth in a saucer, he sniffed again and lapped, slow and careful. A drop clung to his chin like a pearl. She could not help it. She smiled. It had been a long while since anything in this house made her smile without her telling herself to do it. Rain eased from roar to hush. The windows fogged in their corners. Margaret fetched an old flannel shirt from Harold's side of the closet. She hesitated, fingers tracing the worn collar. Then she laid it over the towel so the little fellow might have something soft beneath him. He shifted, barely, and tucked his nose into the fabric, as if it knew the shape of comfort. She should call someone, she told herself. Animal control, perhaps. The thought came and went like a car passing the house at night. Later would be fine. For now, there was only this living thing and the need to be warm, to drink, to breathe. She sat on the floor with her back against the chair and listened to the steady whisper of the heater. The house settled. The clock ticked. The little fellow's breathing grew deeper, less ragged. Margaret felt her shoulders unclench one by one, like a row of tight buttons undone. "You need a name," she said softly. "Something proper, but not too serious. We can't be too serious in this house, not anymore." He made no sign that he heard. A minute later, a tiny paw edged out from the towel and found the flannel, kneading it once, twice, like a memory rising in sleep. "Rusty," she decided, thinking of the reddish tint where the fur wasn't the grey of rainwater. "Rusty will do if you don't mind." For the first time, one eye opened a sliver, dark and watchful. It was not trust, not yet. It was attention. Margaret nodded, as if they had agreed on something. She rose, joints stiff, to set the groceries away. The bag had held up fine, and the bread had not soaked through. She moved through the kitchen on tiptoe, as if not to wake the rain itself. On her way back to the living room, she paused by the mantel. Harold's photograph looked back at her with that same shy smile. "We have company tonight," she said. "A little one. Nothing to worry over." She sat again on the floor and folded her hands in her lap. The quiet that had lived with her since the funeral shifted. Not gone, but not the ruling presence it had been. Outside, a car hissed past on wet pavement. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged and someone called out a good-natured complaint at the weather. Walton Street carried on, indifferent. Rusty stirred, nose twitching. He lifted his head and blinked. The mask on his face gave him a look of permanent mischief, though his body was too tired to live up to it. He regarded her with the stillness of a creature that has survived by measuring everything. "It's all right," she told him. "You're safe here." The heater clicked and hummed. Rusty lowered his head again, this time not quite as far under the towel, and let out a breath that sounded like surrender. Margaret leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. She did not intend to sleep, only to rest them for a minute, but minutes lengthen when the rain keeps time. When she opened her eyes, the room had softened into evening. The streetlight outside spread a pearly triangle on the wall. Rusty was sitting up now, a little unsteady, watching her. It was almost comical, the solemnity of that small face. He glanced at the saucer, then at her, as if to ask for permission, and took another careful drink. Afterward, he licked his paws and patted at his whiskers with a domestic little gesture that surprised her with its neatness. "That's better," she said. "That's a beginning." The rain had dwindled to a drip from the eaves. Margaret stood, turning on a lamp, bathing the room in a gentle gold. Rusty's eyes flashed once at the sudden light, then calmed. She adjusted the flannel to cover more of him and tucked the towel in at his side, like a nurse. She did not think about what tomorrow required, or what the law said, or what neighbors might declare. She thought about a living thing meeting the night with a fighting chance. When she went to the kitchen for a cup of tea, she caught herself humming under her breath, a little tune that had not visited her in years. By the time she returned, the little raccoon had curled, tail ringed over his nose, breath quiet and even. Margaret sat nearby and held her warm mug in both hands. Steam rose and vanished. "Welcome home, Rusty," she said into the hush. He did not answer, not with sound. But a moment later his small paw flexed once against the flannel, and somehow that was answer enough. Morning sunlight broke across the curtains in thin bands, catching the dust motes that floated lazily through Margaret's living room. She had not expected to wake on the sofa, but her neck reminded her she had dozed there with her head bent against the armrest. When she lifted her chin, she saw him, Rusty, still curled in the nest of flannel and towels. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of sleep. For a moment she thought she had imagined the whole episode, that the storm and the discovery in the trash can had been a dream stitched together by loneliness. Then Rusty stirred, stretched one paw with surprising delicacy, and blinked at her. No, he was real, and so was the faint warmth he had brought into the house. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. Margaret busied herself making oatmeal, more from habit than hunger. She slid a small portion aside, cooled it, and mixed in a bit of milk. Setting the bowl near Rusty, she crouched down. He sniffed at it, his black nose twitching. At first he pulled back, suspicious. Then, with a sudden decision, he dipped his tongue and began to lap. His little jaws worked earnestly, and the sound of him eating filled the quiet in a way the ticking clock never had. Margaret sat cross-legged on the rug and watched him, her hand resting loosely on her knee. "You're hungrier than you let on," she murmured. "I know the feeling." As the day settled into its gentle routine, she noticed the house no longer echoed in quite the same way. Rusty explored cautiously, hobbling at first, sniffing every table leg and chair rung. He nosed at the rug, pawed the corner of the drapes, and stopped in front of Harold's photograph on the mantel. Margaret stiffened as the raccoon raised himself on his hind legs, pawing the frame until it tipped. She darted forward, catching the picture before it struck the hearth. Her chest tightened. "Oh no, not that one," she said, voice quivering. She pressed the frame to her chest, looking at Harold's kind, faded smile. Rusty cocked his head at her, eyes dark pools of mischief and curiosity. Instead of scolding, she found herself laughing through the lump in her throat. "You rascal," she whispered. "Even Harold would forgive you." She set the frame back carefully and stroked Rusty's fur once, tentative, amazed when he didn't recoil. The days that followed were filled with moments that both tested her patience and mended something within her. She discovered Rusty had a knack for rummaging. More than once, she walked into the kitchen to find the lid of the bread box nudged open, crumbs scattered across the counter, and Rusty perched like a guilty sentinel. He dragged socks from the laundry basket and paraded them across the hallway. Once he managed to pull an entire roll of paper towels into the living room, shredding it into white confetti until the floor looked like a snowstorm had swept through. Margaret shook her head, half exasperated, half amused, as she swept up the trail. "You're more trouble than a classroom of fourth graders," she told him, and the memory of her teaching days flickered in her chest with a surprising tenderness. Yet for all his mischief, Rusty had a way of softening the edges of her solitude. In the evenings, when Margaret sat knitting by the lamp, she would feel the faintest brush against her ankle. Looking down, she would see Rusty curling near her feet, his mask-like face tilted toward the warmth of the light. The first time it happened, she held her breath, afraid to move. Slowly she lowered her hand until it hovered just above his back. When he didn't flinch, she allowed her fingers to graze the fur, coarse at first, but soft underneath. He gave a tiny grunt, more like acknowledgement than protest. That night, she went to bed lighter than she had in years. The neighborhood, however, was not blind. Mrs. Elkins across the street spotted the small, bandit-masked creature one afternoon as he scampered along the porch rail. She called out from her driveway, "Margaret, is that a raccoon you're keeping?" Margaret forced a laugh, waved, and mumbled something about nursing an injured stray. The doubt in her neighbor's eyes lingered. Later that evening, Margaret shut the curtains tighter than usual. She realized she had not told anyone, had not wanted to, because something about Rusty felt like a secret meant only for her. Still, loneliness has sharp corners, and Rusty's antics smoothed them. One gray afternoon, she returned from the mailbox to find him perched on the back of Harold's old armchair, tail flicking, eyes bright. He leapt clumsily onto the end table, knocking over a small ceramic dish Harold had bought on their honeymoon in Maine. Margaret gasped, but Rusty caught himself, paws scrabbling, and the dish spun without breaking. She collapsed into laughter, the kind that bubbled up unexpectedly, startling her with its sound. For the first time in years, the walls of her house seemed to echo with something other than silence. That night, she warmed milk on the stove and poured herself a cup of tea. Rusty padded into the kitchen, nose twitching. He pawed at her slipper, and without thinking, she poured a small saucer of milk and set it on the floor. He drank greedily, leaving a white mustache on his dark fur. Margaret shook her head and whispered, "You're going to spoil me as much as I spoil you." The weeks turned gently, marked by the rhythm of their shared days. Margaret tended her garden while Rusty pawed curiously at flower pots. She dusted the shelves while Rusty clambered from one chair to another, exploring with tireless energy. More than once, she found herself talking aloud to him as she moved through her chores, as if his bright, watchful eyes were enough to make conversation real again. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in violet and rose, Margaret sat on the porch rocker, with Rusty curled at her feet. The cicadas hummed, the air heavy with summer. She reached down to stroke his back. He shifted only slightly, as though reluctant, but willing to allow the gesture. She whispered, "It's been a long time since I had anyone to sit with." The words surprised her, but they felt true, and in speaking them she felt something inside her loosen. Yet beneath the warmth, Margaret sensed the weight of uncertainty. Rusty was clever, wilder than any pet she had known. His eyes, bright with mischief, seemed to carry a question she could not answer. How long could this balance last? For now, though, she allowed herself to sink into the comfort of his presence, the comfort of noise and motion, in a house too long ruled by quiet. When she finally rose to go inside, Rusty followed at her heel, his small paws clicking on the wooden floor. Margaret glanced back at Harold's photograph on the mantel, the shadows gentle across his smiling face. "It's not just me anymore," she whispered. "We've got company." Rusty gave a soft huff, curling on the rug as she dimmed the lights. Margaret carried the feeling with her into bed, where for the first time in years, she slept without waking in the dark to listen for the silence. Margaret's house had grown louder in those weeks, full of small crashes, curious rummaging, and the constant shuffle of little paws. She had learned to live with Rusty's mischief, even come to expect it. The silence that once filled every corner had retreated, replaced by an unpredictable rhythm. But the world beyond her porch was not deaf to what was happening inside her walls, and soon another presence pressed in on her newfound companionship. It began with the sound of a throat clearing across the hedge. Margaret was in her front garden, trimming back rose bushes, when she noticed Mr. Harris leaning on his cane by the mailbox. His grey hair was clipped short, his shirt buttoned to the neck, even on a warm day. He had lived 2 doors down for as long as she could remember, a retired police officer with a habit of watching the neighborhood like it was still his beat. "Afternoon, Margaret," he called, voice steady and low. "You've got yourself a visitor, haven't you?" Margaret froze. Pruning shears paused in her hand. Rusty had scrambled up onto the porch rail behind her, tail flicking in that mischievous way of his. He tilted his masked face toward Harris, eyes bright with curiosity. Margaret forced a smile. "Just a little fellow I'm helping along." He was hurt. Harris's gaze sharpened. "That's no kitten. That's a raccoon. Wild animal. You know what they can carry? Disease, bad temper. Not something you want under your roof." Rusty gave a small huff, as if answering for himself, then darted along the porch railing and disappeared through the open door. Margaret swallowed. She had half expected this conversation, but it still unsettled her. "He's not dangerous," she said, quieter now. "He just needs a chance." Harris tapped the ground with his cane, the sound sharp against the pavement. "Margaret, you're kind. Always were. But kindness doesn't change nature. That creature doesn't belong in a house. If you're not careful, someone's going to call animal control." She nodded politely, unwilling to argue in the open air. "Thank you for your concern." When Harris walked away, his shoulders stiff, Margaret carried her clippers back inside. Rusty was waiting in the hallway, one paw on the umbrella stand as if he had been listening. She crouched, running a hand along his back. "They don't know you like I do," she whispered. "You're not trouble, not really." Yet that night, when she drew the curtains against the dark, she could not shake Harris's words. She sat by the lamp, knitting needles idle in her lap, and wondered how long a secret could remain a secret when the whole street had eyes. The following week, the whispers began. Mrs. Elkins, carrying her groceries, paused on the sidewalk to ask whether Margaret had taken up keeping pets again. A teenager riding by on a bike shouted, "Cool raccoon, lady!" before pedaling off with a laugh. Margaret's cheeks burned, but she kept her answers vague, her smile steady. Behind closed doors, though, she worried. Rusty, for his part, seemed oblivious. He had grown bolder, patrolling the kitchen counters and prying at cupboard doors. One morning, Margaret found him perched on top of the refrigerator, a box of cereal between his paws. When she scolded him, he simply chirped in that odd, squeaky way of his, and tumbled down into her arms, leaving her half laughing, half exasperated. But his antics carried risk. One afternoon, Rusty escaped onto the porch while Margaret fetched laundry from the line. A group of children down the block pointed and shouted, "Look, a raccoon!" One boy picked up a stick and waved it like a sword. Margaret hurried to scoop Rusty into her arms, heart thudding. The children's laughter followed her back inside, sharp and mocking. She held Rusty close until his trembling eased. Later, as dusk fell, Harris knocked at her door. "Margaret," he said when she opened it, "I don't mean to pry, but word is spreading. Folks get scared easy when wild things are close by. I don't want to see you hurt, or him either." His eyes, though stern, carried a trace of something softer. Concern, perhaps, or weariness. She hesitated, then invited him in. Rusty peered from behind the sofa, his mask-like face half hidden in the lamplight. Harris studied him for a long moment. "You see the way he watches? That's not a house pet stare. That's wild." "He's calculating." Margaret folded her hands. "He's also loyal. He follows me from room to room. He listens when I talk. I know what I've taken in, Mr. Harris, but he's alive because I couldn't walk past him." For a long silence, only the ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Then Harris sighed, shifting his weight on the cane. "You always had more heart than the rest of us. Just be careful, Margaret. That heart of yours could get you hurt." He tipped his head and left. When the door closed, Rusty crept forward, placing one paw on her knee. She stroked his fur absently, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the window. The tension of the neighborhood settled over her in the days that followed, yet inside the little house her bond with Rusty deepened. She found herself speaking more freely to him, recalling memories of Harold, telling stories of her students, even humming songs long forgotten. At night, when the rain tapped the roof or the wind rattled the shutters, she no longer feared the silence. Rusty's steady breathing on the rug reminded her she was not alone. Still, beneath her affection, lay the awareness of a gathering storm. Harris's words, the children's laughter, the sharp glances from neighbors, all of it built a pressure she could not ignore. Rusty might have softened the edges of her solitude, but he also carried with him a wildness the world would not easily forgive. And as she watched him one evening, balancing on the back of the sofa, with gleaming eyes fixed on the darkened yard, she wondered for the first time if Harris had been right. Kindness alone might not be enough to keep the world at bay. The days slipped into weeks, and Margaret found herself adjusting to a rhythm she had never imagined. Life with Rusty was not simple, not orderly, but it was alive, and she cherished that above all. He had grown stronger, his once weak legs now steady, his glossy fur gleaming in the light that poured through the kitchen window. With strength, though, came a restlessness that turned her quiet home into a stage for his endless curiosity. One morning she awoke to the sound of clattering. Heart racing, she shuffled into the kitchen, only to find Rusty perched on the counter, both front paws sunk deep in the cookie jar. Crumbs dotted his whiskers like freckles. When she gasped his name, he froze, eyes wide with the guilty look of a child caught red-handed. For a heartbeat, she considered scolding him. Then he tilted his head, chewed loudly, and gave a squeaky chirp that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth and laughed too, long and hard, her sides aching. It had been years since anything made her laugh like that. Rusty's antics grew daily. He learned to open the bread box with his nimble paws, dragging the loaf across the kitchen floor and shredding it into pieces too large for his little mouth. He figured out how to nudge the bathroom door open, startling Margaret one evening when she found him pawing at the cabinet under the sink. His favorite discovery, though, was the refrigerator. The first time she found him hanging from the handle, swinging his weight until the door creaked open, she could not decide whether to scold or applaud his cleverness. He sniffed around until he found a leftover piece of chicken, clutching it with triumphant glee. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "You're too smart for your own good," she muttered, and he chirped again, as if to agree. But along with trouble came tenderness. At night, after his explorations, Rusty often padded quietly into the living room, where Margaret sat with her knitting or a book. Without fanfare, he would curl at her feet or climb onto the arm of her chair. His small body radiated warmth, his breathing steady, and she began to look forward to those moments more than she admitted. She found herself talking to him, sharing thoughts she had long kept to herself. "You know," she whispered one night, "Harold would have liked you. He always had patience for little rascals." Rusty stirred, blinking at her as if he understood. One Sunday afternoon, the television played a nature program while Margaret folded laundry. She paid little attention until the announcer spoke of wildlife, showing footage of raccoons raiding campsites, prying open coolers, and sneaking into attics. The creatures on the screen moved with the same sharp-eyed cleverness Rusty displayed each day. Margaret froze, a folded towel in her hands. The commentary spoke of raccoons as survivors, resourceful but wild, never truly tame. The camera showed one balancing on a garbage can, bandit mask gleaming under the nightlights. Rusty, sitting on the rug, lifted his head at the sound, his ears twitching. A chill passed through Margaret. She turned to look at him. The same markings, the same quick intelligence. For the first time, she saw not just a playful companion, but a creature who belonged to a different world, one where instincts ruled and people were strangers. "What are you, really?" she asked aloud. Rusty blinked, then promptly knocked the folded towel from the chair, as if to remind her he was also a prankster. That evening, Mr. Harris stopped by to check on her, his cane tapping on the porch steps. Rusty, as if sensing the man's disapproval, darted behind the curtains, only his ringed tail poking out. Harris noticed and shook his head. "See? He hides from me because he knows he's not meant to be here. Margaret, I've seen enough to know trouble when it's brewing." "That raccoon isn't a pet." Margaret folded her arms. "He's more than trouble. He's company. He's comfort. That's more than I've had in a long while." Her voice wavered, but her resolve did not. Harris's gaze softened, though his words stayed firm. "I don't doubt he makes you smile. But wild things always show their nature in the end. Just be careful." He tipped his hat and left, leaving her with the heavy echo of his warning. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found Rusty perched on the dresser, pawing at Harold's old wristwatch. She gasped, rushing forward, afraid he would send it crashing to the floor. Instead, Rusty carefully nudged it toward her, almost deliberate, as though presenting a gift. She cradled the watch in her palm, her throat tightening. "You little thief," she whispered, brushing her fingers along his back. But in her chest, she felt something else, something like gratitude. In the days that followed, Rusty's playful destruction mingled with moments of startling gentleness. He shredded paper towels into confetti, then curled against her shoulder while she cleaned it up. He dug through her knitting basket, scattering yarn across the rug, but later climbed into her lap, purring softly as if to apologize. Every act of chaos seemed paired with a quiet moment that bound him closer to her heart. Margaret began to realize that she was no longer counting the hours of the day by the clock on the wall. She counted them instead by Rusty's adventures. The crash in the kitchen, the rustle under the bed, the gentle weight of him at her side. Yet the thought of the nature program lingered in her mind like a shadow. She knew, though she tried to forget, that Rusty was not hers to keep forever. Late one evening, she sat by the window with a cup of tea. Rusty clambered onto the sill, pressing his nose against the glass as the streetlights flickered on. His reflection stared back at him, eyes gleaming. Margaret reached out, stroking his fur. "You're not like any cat or dog I've ever known," she said. "You're wilder, smarter. But you're mine, for now. And that's enough." The words steadied her, even as she felt the truth beneath them. Outside, the neighborhood whispered. Mr. Harris warned, and the television reminded her of Rusty's wild blood. But in that moment, with his warm little body pressed against her arm, she chose not to think of the future. She chose only the present. A house no longer silent, a heart no longer hollow, and a raccoon who had made mischief into love. Summer nights in Ohio could be heavy, the air thick with the hum of insects and the smell of damp earth from the creek beyond the street. Margaret had gone to bed later than usual, the lamp still burning low in the living room. Rusty had worn himself out, after spending the evening wrestling with a shoelace he had tugged loose from one of Harold's old boots. Now he lay curled on the rug, tail draped over his nose, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Margaret paused at the doorway before retiring, smiling at the sight. "Good night, little rascal," she whispered, and the house settled into silence. But silence in a house is fragile. It can be shattered in an instant. Sometime after midnight, Margaret woke with a start. At first she thought the noise was part of a dream. The crash of something breaking, a dull thud, then the faint scrape of movement. She held her breath, listening. There it was again, the sound of glass crunching underfoot. Her pulse quickened. Someone was inside. Before she could swing her legs out of bed, a low growl carried from the living room. It was not the warning rumble of a dog, but something raw, higher, edged with wildness. Rusty. Margaret clutched the edge of her blanket, frozen. Then came the slam of a drawer, the heavy tread of boots on her wooden floor. She forced herself to stand, her knees trembling, and crept toward the door. From the hallway, she could see the faint glow of the lamp and the dark shape of a man rifling through the cabinet drawers. His back was bent, shoulders hunched, movements quick and careless. He muttered something under his breath, the words muffled. And there, only a few feet away, Rusty crouched low, his ringed tail puffed like a bottle brush, eyes burning like coals in the dim light. He bared his small teeth and gave a guttural hiss. The man turned, startled. "What the?" he muttered, reaching out a hand as if to swat the creature away. It happened fast. Rusty lunged, a blur of fur and fury, sinking his teeth into the intruder's wrist. The man shouted, stumbling backward, knocking over a chair in the process. Margaret gasped, hand flying to her mouth. She wanted to call out, to stop Rusty, but fear held her still. The struggle was brief but chaotic, the man flailing, Rusty clinging fiercely, claws scratching against denim. At last the man yanked his arm free, swore loudly and bolted for the door. He crashed into the night, leaving the front door wide open, rain-damp air sweeping in behind him. The street fell silent once more. Rusty stood in the center of the living room, sides heaving, fur bristled, his small frame still quivering with adrenaline. Margaret hurried to him, nearly tripping over the fallen chair. She knelt, reaching out with trembling hands. "Oh, my heavens, Rusty. You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking. She gathered him close, and for once, he didn't squirm away. He pressed against her chest, panting, his body warm and alive in her arms. She sat there for a long while, rocking slightly, listening to the night sounds beyond the open door. The intruder was gone, but the shock lingered. Margaret's hands shook as she stroked Rusty's back. She thought of what might have happened if he hadn't been there. The thought chilled her, but alongside it came a fierce surge of gratitude. By the time dawn brushed the sky with pale light, she had tidied the broken glass and set the chair upright. Rusty slept curled in his makeshift bed, utterly spent. Margaret brewed a pot of coffee, her body aching from the night's ordeal. She stared out the window at the quiet street. Later that morning, Mr. Harris stopped by, cane tapping as he crossed her porch. He had heard the commotion. "Everything all right, Margaret?" His eyes searched her face, reading the exhaustion there. Margaret hesitated, then opened the door wider. Rusty was awake again, sitting on the rug, licking one paw. Harris's gaze hardened. "That animal." But Margaret interrupted, her voice clear despite her fatigue. "That animal saved me last night. There was a man in my house." Rusty chased him off. Harris blinked, taken aback. For once, words seemed to fail him. He studied Rusty, then Margaret, his jaw tight. "Well," he muttered at last, "that's something." He tipped his head and left, more subdued than she had ever seen him. When the door closed, Margaret returned to Rusty. He looked up at her with those dark, clever eyes, and she knelt to meet his gaze. "You're not just mischief, are you?" she said softly. "You're my guardian." Rusty tilted his head, then nudged her hand with his nose, demanding another stroke. Margaret obliged, smiling through tears. The bond between them had shifted overnight. Mischief had become loyalty. Trouble had become protection. And Margaret knew, deep in her heart, that the little raccoon had claimed a place no neighbor's warning could dislodge. That night, as she drew the curtains and locked the doors, Margaret whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. For the first time since Harold's passing, she felt safe. Not because she was alone, but because someone, even a wild creature, was watching over her. The days after the break-in passed in a haze of relief and uneasy calm. Margaret found herself glancing more often at the locks on her doors, listening for footsteps that never came. She told herself she was safe now, that no intruder would dare return after what had happened. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't the locks that made her feel secure. It was the little creature who had stood his ground when she could not. Rusty basked in her gratitude without ever knowing it. He strutted about the house with a new boldness, climbing shelves and perching on high places as if to survey his territory. Margaret sometimes laughed, watching him sway his ringed tail like a banner. "You think you're king of this place, don't you?" she said one afternoon. Rusty chirped back as if he understood every word. But not everyone saw him through the same eyes. The neighbors had heard stories. Children on bicycles slowed as they passed her house, pointing and whispering. Mrs. Elkins muttered to another woman on her porch, shaking her head. Even though Margaret ignored them, she felt the weight of their judgment pressing on her every time she stepped outside. Only Harris kept his silence now. Though his eyes still held warning, his voice had softened since the night of the intruder. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a bright Saturday, the kind of day when children poured into the street with chalk and balls and laughter that carried down the block. Margaret was watering her flowers in the front yard. Rusty, as usual, had grown restless. He scampered out the door before she could stop him, his small paws pattering across the porch. He paused at the steps, sniffing the air, then bounded into the yard. "Rusty, stay close," Margaret called, her heart already uneasy. The children noticed him instantly. A girl shrieked in delight. "Look, a raccoon!" Others gathered, curiosity mixing with the nervous thrill of seeing something wild. Most kept their distance, but one boy, older with a mean streak Margaret had seen before, picked up a stone. He tossed it lightly in his hand, grinning. "Bet it won't come near if we scare it." Margaret's voice cracked across the yard. "Don't you dare!" But the boy's arm was already in motion. The stone arced through the air and struck Rusty on the hind leg. A sharp cry cut the summer air, higher and more pained than Margaret had ever heard from him. Rusty stumbled, fell awkwardly, then scrambled backward, limping. The children gasped, some laughing nervously, others running. The boy dropped the rest of his stones and bolted down the street, his bravado gone. Margaret's watering can clattered to the ground. She rushed across the grass, her breath ragged. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, dropping to her knees. Rusty's body trembled as he tried to stand, his eyes wide with fear. When she reached for him, he let out a low hiss, instinct driving him to protect himself even from her. The sound broke her heart. "It's me," she pleaded, tears blurring her vision. "It's just me. I'll help you." Carefully, gently, she slid her arms under his body. He quivered but did not fight, too weak to resist. She carried him inside, setting him on the sofa atop the old flannel that had long since become his bed. His hind leg was swollen, the fur matted with dirt where the stone had struck. Margaret's hands shook as she fetched a basin of warm water and the small tin of ointment from her cabinet. She spoke softly as she worked, her voice trembling like a prayer. "I should have never let you out there. I should have kept you safe." Rusty whimpered when the cloth touched his leg, but after a moment he stilled, watching her with weary eyes. She dabbed the wound, applied the ointment, and wrapped the leg with strips of clean cloth. When she was done, she sat back, her tears falling freely. Mr. Harris appeared at her door not long after, drawn by the commotion. His cane tapped the floor as he stepped inside. "What happened?" Margaret swallowed hard. "The neighborhood kids. They threw a rock. He's hurt." Harris's jaw tightened. He lowered himself carefully into a chair, his gaze fixed on Rusty. The little raccoon was curled tightly, breathing shallow, the bandage stark against his fur. After a long silence, Harris spoke. "I warned you, Margaret, not because I dislike the creature, but because I've seen too much of what happens when wild animals and people mix. Folks get scared, and scared folks do foolish things." Margaret pressed a hand to her eyes. "I only wanted to help him, to give him a place where he was safe, but now I've put him in more danger than ever." Harris's voice softened. "You did save him once, maybe more than once, but sometimes saving something means letting it go where it belongs." The words struck her like the toll of a bell. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that Rusty was family now, that he was hers. But as she looked at the small body trembling on the sofa, she felt the truth rising in her chest. Love was not keeping him here where stones could fly and neighbors could whisper. Love was something harder. That night, Margaret sat beside Rusty's makeshift bed, her knitting abandoned on the floor. The lamp cast a circle of warm light, and outside the cicadas hummed their endless song. Rusty stirred, lifting his head to look at her. His eyes were tired, but in them she saw trust, faint but real. She reached out, brushing her fingers along his bandaged leg. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to see you hurt. Maybe Harris is right. Maybe what's best for you isn't here with me." Rusty blinked slowly, then lowered his head again, as if surrendering to her care. Margaret sat there until the house grew quiet and the night stretched long, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their days together might be numbered. When dawn came, she opened the curtains and let the pale light spill across the room. Rusty shifted, eyes glinting faintly. Margaret whispered to him, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Rest now, little guardian. We'll figure this out. I promise." The promise rang hollow, though, because deep inside she already knew the truth. The wound on Rusty's leg was not just a bruise from a boy's careless stone. It was a reminder that the world outside her door would never let him be what he had become, inside her heart. And that realization hurt more than any stone ever could. The days after Rusty's injury were filled with quiet care. Margaret tended to him as if he were a child, changing his bandage, wiping his fur with a damp cloth, coaxing him to sip broth from a saucer. He tolerated it all with a patience that surprised her, though sometimes he gave her a weak hiss, as if to remind her he was still wild. Yet in those evenings, when she sat close with her knitting needles silent, Rusty would press his masked face into her palm, as though he knew she was the reason he still breathed. But the fear in Margaret's heart grew heavier with each sunrise. The memory of the stone striking Rusty replayed again and again. She could not shake the sound of his cry, or the way his body trembled in her arms. Each time she glanced out the window at the neighborhood children playing, her stomach knotted. They weren't cruel at heart, just careless, just scared. And scared, people could destroy what they didn't understand. One evening, Mr. Harris came by with a bag of canned soup from his pantry. He set it on her counter without a word, then lowered himself into her chair, cane propped at his side. Rusty, legs still wrapped, peered from behind the sofa with watchful eyes. Harris studied him for a long moment. "He's healing," he said finally. "But Margaret, you know as well as I do, this can't last." Margaret clasped her hands together, staring at the floor. "I love him," she admitted, voice breaking. After Harold, I thought I was done loving. I thought there was nothing left but empty rooms and long nights. And then Rusty came, and suddenly I had a reason to wake up, a reason to laugh again." Harris's gaze softened. "I don't doubt that. He's given you something back. But ask yourself, what are you giving him in return? He doesn't belong in this street. He belongs under trees, not under a roof." The words stung because they were true. Margaret spent that night pacing her living room, the clock ticking loudly, Rusty asleep on the couch. She imagined a future where he grew stronger, larger, cleverer. What then? What if neighbors called the authorities? What if children cornered him again? She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering to herself, "I can't keep him safe here. I can't." The next morning, she made the call. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number Harris had given her weeks before, the Wildlife Rescue Center on the outskirts of town. A calm voice answered, listened to her story, and promised to help. They would assess Rusty's health, give him the care he needed, and prepare him for release into a protected woodland. When she hung up the phone, Margaret sat in her kitchen and wept, shoulders shaking. Rusty padded in, dragging a dish towel from the counter, chirping as if to scold her. She bent down, wrapping him in her arms. "You don't understand, do you?" she whispered. "I'm doing this because I love you." The days until the appointment passed too quickly. Margaret found herself treasuring every mischief, every sound. When Rusty dragged the newspapers across the floor, she didn't scold. When he tipped over the vase of daisies, she only laughed through tears. Even his pawing at the refrigerator door felt like a gift, a memory to carry after he was gone. On the final evening, Margaret sat on the porch with him. The air smelled of honeysuckle, and the sky glowed with the colors of dusk. Rusty nestled against her feet, his injured leg mending but still stiff. She stroked his fur slowly, speaking aloud, though no one else could hear. "You've been my guardian, my rascal, my laughter. Harold would have loved you. He'd tell me I was right to take you in, but he'd tell me I'm right to let you go too." That night, Rusty surprised her. Instead of curling on the rug, he climbed onto her lap, awkward with his healing leg, and settled against her chest. Margaret froze, hardly daring to breathe. His small body was warm, his fur soft beneath her trembling hands. He tilted his masked face upward, his dark eyes calm. For the first time, he seemed utterly at peace with her touch. Margaret bent her head, tears slipping onto his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Morning came too soon. Harris drove her to the rescue center, his truck rattling over the country road. Rusty sat in a crate on the seat beside her, quiet but watchful. Margaret kept her fingers through the bars, and he pressed his paw against them as if to hold her hand. Neither moved for miles. At the center, a kind-faced veterinarian met them at the gate. "He's strong," she said after a quick look. "He'll do well in the reserve. He'll have trees to climb, streams to wade, all the space he needs." Margaret nodded, though her throat ached too much for words. When the time came, she carried the crate to the edge of the reserve. Her knees wobbled, but she held steady. She opened the door and stepped back. Rusty hesitated, sniffing the air, then padded out, ringed tail flicking. He turned once, fixing her with a long, steady gaze. His eyes seemed to carry both question and answer, gratitude and farewell. "Go on, Rusty," Margaret whispered, tears streaming. "This is your home now. Not my little house, not my porch. Here." Rusty chirped once, then bounded into the tall grass. Within moments, he disappeared among the trees. Margaret stood rooted, staring at the place where the wild had swallowed him. On the drive home, she kept her hands folded in her lap, silent. Harris didn't speak either, only reached once to pat her shoulder, rough but gentle. Back at her house, she stepped inside. The room's quiet once more. She braced for the crushing silence she had known before Rusty. But as she looked at the shredded newspaper by the chair, the faint scratch marks on the door, the empty saucer on the counter, she realized the silence was different now. It was full of memory, full of life, that had passed through and left its mark. That night, she sat by Harold's photograph and whispered, "I let him go, because I loved him enough to do it." She closed her eyes and pictured Rusty darting through the woods, clever and free, the rascal who had taught her heart to beat again. Autumn came early that year, carrying crisp mornings and the scent of wood smoke from chimneys up and down Walton Street. Margaret moved through her days with a steadiness she had not known before Rusty. She rose at dawn, tended her flowers, brewed her coffee, and spoke aloud to Harold's photograph, the way she once spoke to the little raccoon. The house was quiet again, yes, but no longer empty. Every corner bore the memory of Rusty's mischief. Faint scratches on the porch rail, the tiny dent on the cookie jar lid, the frayed shoelace that she never repaired. He was gone, yet present everywhere. At night, when she sat knitting by the lamplight, she often caught herself listening for the patter of small paws on the floorboards. Sometimes, she even set a saucer of milk by the heater vent, though she knew it would be untouched in the morning. She told herself it was foolish, but the gesture comforted her. It made the silence gentler, less final. Neighbors had stopped whispering. Children still played in the street, but they no longer peered toward her porch. Mr. Harris checked on her from time to time, never mentioning Rusty directly, but always with a softer look in his eye. Once, when he saw her sweeping the porch, he tipped his hat and said quietly, "You did right by him." The words lingered, carrying both closure and pride. One bright afternoon, Margaret decided to visit the reserve. She told herself she was only out for a walk, that she wanted to see the autumn colors by the creek. But in her heart, she knew she was drawn there by something deeper, a hope she could not name. The trail wound through maples and oaks, blazing with red and gold. Her breath misted in the cool air, and the crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound, besides the distant calls of birds. She paused by a clearing where sunlight pooled on the forest floor. For a moment, she let herself imagine Rusty darting through the trees, tail flashing like a striped banner. She smiled at the thought, though her chest ached. "I hope you're happy out here," she whispered into the quiet. Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it, a low, familiar chirp. She froze, heart hammering. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to the branches above. There he was. Rusty perched on a thick limb, his body poised and strong, his fur glossy in the slanting light. His eyes, dark and clever, locked onto hers. For a breathless moment, the years fell away, and she was back in her living room, watching him tug socks across the floor, hearing the crash of a cookie jar. Tears welled in her eyes. "Rusty," she whispered, voice breaking. He did not climb down. He did not rush into her arms. Instead, he tilted his head, tail flicking once, and made a soft sound that echoed through the trees. It was not a cry, not a growl, something between a farewell and a greeting. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. She understood. He belonged here now, not in her little house on Walton Street. Yet he had come, just this once, to show her he was well, to remind her that their bond had not vanished with the opening of a crate door. She raised her hand in a trembling wave. "Be safe, my rascal, my little guardian." "Thank you for finding me again." Rusty blinked, then turned gracefully, slipping along the branch and vanishing into the blaze of autumn leaves. The forest closed around him, silent but alive. Margaret stood there for a long while, her tears drying in the cool wind. She did not call after him. She did not beg him to return. Instead, she felt a warmth rise in her chest, filling the space where grief had once lived. She knew she would carry this moment, the look in his eyes, the sound of his chirp, as proof that love, even across boundaries of species and worlds, could endure. When she finally made her way back home, the house did not seem so small. She brewed a cup of tea, set her knitting basket by her chair, and looked at Harold's photograph. "I saw him today," she told the smiling face. "He's strong, he's free, and I'm all right too." She sat quietly, listening to the faint creak of the house settling around her. The silence no longer pressed. It held her gently, like an old friend. Somewhere out in the woods, Rusty was climbing, running, living. She pictured him pausing now and then, ears twitching, as if remembering the woman who once gave him shelter on a stormy night. Margaret closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. Love had come to her in the form of a wild, mischievous raccoon. Love had left her too, but not empty-handed. It had given her laughter, courage, and the strength to let go. And as she drifted into sleep that night, she whispered into the stillness, "Good night, Rusty, wherever you are." The house was quiet, but in her dreams she heard the faint patter of paws, the rustle of mischief, and the echo of a bond that would never truly fade. If you made it to the end, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so I know you're here. Your little note means the world to me. And don't forget to subscribe. There are many more heartwarming raccoon stories waiting for you. Stay with us. The next story might surprise you even more.